And we are back with more on News Talk Saga 960. So very glad you could join us on this edition of the Mark Petranis Show. Well, is it time to fire Tiff Macklem, governor of the Bank of Canada? I mean, if you or I were particularly incompetent, wouldn't we have to pay the price? But in Macklem's case, because he's an elitist, because he's part of the smart set, the country club set, well, it just seems that they are bubble wrapped. And it's interesting. He is coming out now and saying, yeah, I blew it on repeatedly missing my inflation targets. He kept underestimating the inflation. I mean, a lot of us saw it coming. Lord knows we felt it, but not Tiff. Tiff somehow didn't see it coming because he's so smart. Maybe he didn't see it coming because he's so rich and he makes so much money. He's so disconnected from what ordinary Canadians are experiencing that he never really understood the impact of rising prices and whether or not he should do something like, namely, raise interest rates long before he did. Anyway, we're in a position now of listening to this guy explain himself, often make excuses, but ultimately admit that he failed. My question is, why does he still have a job? So why not bring in Tom Quiggin, who had a key role at the Bank of Canada for a time? And Tom, welcome to the show.
Always good to be back at Saga Radio, Mark. And yeah, just so your viewers know, I was the Security and Operational Risk Manager for the Bank of Canada from 2010 to about 2012. And worked extensively with the G10 Central Banks Group. It was an absolutely fascinating education to work there, Mark.
Okay, well, you were in on some of the decision making, so you know how important that job is. I mean, if he screws up, well, a lot of people pay the price in terms of being unable to make ends meet, and so we're seeing the impact from the fact that prices are going up, fuel prices, grocery prices, and so he admits now that he kept underestimating the impact of inflation, didn't see it coming. My question to you is, should Tiff Macklem go?
Well, it's an interesting question, Mark, and there's a lot of grounds to say that, like you said, if you and I messed up as bad in our jobs, we'd be invited to take a walk out the door. First off, just for your viewers, as somebody who's worked extensively in the political world and the economic world, I would say there's more science in political science than there is in economic science. Economics is known as the dismal science for a reason. Secondly, central bank in the entire history of central banks, which goes back, well over 100 years or so, has ever successfully predicted the onset of a recession. So all the money, all the quants, all the squints, all the PhDs, all those people, none of them have ever accurately predicted a recession. So, if you ask, should Tiff Macklem be fired for failing to meet the standard? Well, he kind of meets the standard of the central bank world where their efficacy in this area has been limited. Now, with respect to inflation, Macklem is caught in a bind here, as are many other central bank governors. We all know inflation's been real. Anybody who pays attention know that it's been real for well over a year, as you've watched gas prices go up, grocery prices go up. Prices on housing in Canada are going up, like 15, 20% a year, an absolutely staggering amount of inflation in that area. But the way to fix inflation, typically, according to standard economics as practiced by the Bank of Canada, is to raise interest rates. And the problem with that, of course, is if you spike interest rates, if they went back to normal like they were back in 2007, 2008, something like that, the overnight lending rate might go to like 3 or 4%. The problem with that is it would kill most governments. In other words, if the government of Canada had to pay its debts at 3 or 4% instead of like 0.5% or 1%, the increase on the debt load to the taxpayers would soar massively. Same in the US, same in the United Kingdom, same in France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, you name it. They've all got the same problem. So the bank is caught between crashing the economy and crashing the government on one hand, and watching inflation go ahead and destroy everybody else's wealth. So here's one other thing. Inflation works to the interest of the government. If you're an overspending government, you like a certain amount of inflation because it decreases your cost of borrowing. It decreases the amount of debt you have to pay by effectively lowering the value of each dollar. And it effectively serves to transfer wealth from the poor and the middle class into the tax coffers of the government. So it's a way of extracting wealth out of the population without actually increasing taxes. So there's a lot of reasons behind what's going on. But yeah, I think instead of asking the question, should we fire Tiff Macklem, the actual question should be, what the heck are central banks doing? Why have they got us into such a mess? And do we really need central banks in our economy, or would there be a better way of managing the role of the central bank? Because central banks collectively are killing us. Now, one other quick thought before I turn it back to you. When I worked for the United Nations in the former Yugoslavia, I realized very quickly that what outwardly appeared to be an organization with a certain set of skills and abilities, on the inside, it was an organization that was just making it up as they go along. Every day was a new crisis. Every day was a new way of muddling through. After having worked for central banks for a while, I realized the same thing. All the PhDs, all the squints, all the quants, all those people they've got, the reality is they're muddling through it as much as everybody else does. And the outward facade of organization and skills and stability and control and calmness is largely manufactured, Mark.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack of what you just said. I mean, I take your point. The government gets a certain benefit out of some inflation, but I think that only applies if you don't have to increase interest rates. So things are getting out of hand now. I think that's the issue now.
Things
And
are
I
out of
mean,
hand, exactly, yes.
I mean, the fact that this guy has screwed up as long as he has, and it's not like he wasn't warned. I mean, you had people like, former finance critic Paul Yep. I don't know if he still is that, I guess, but he's running for the leadership of the party. But coming out, he warned Macklem about this. He was laughed at. He was mocked. Well, now we have him coming out, meaning Macklem, and saying, "Okay, fine, I blew it. What are you going to? I mean, what are you going to do about it?" But now he's also saying, "But trust me, we're on it now, right?" To which I would say, well, you blew it before. Why should anybody trust anything you have to say now? But the other question I would have is on this latest appointment, this liberal being appointed, a liberal donor, now appointed to the job of having to oversee the reasoning behind the rationale behind the government's decision to impose the Emergencies Act. To me, it's martial law under a different name or close to it. But here we have a liberal connected person. So right away, there's cynicism right off the bat. And in fact, we even have a comment already from someone saying liberal hack is the right choice of word for this one. This is Wayback Machine, suggesting that he doesn't have much faith, or she doesn't have much faith in the government's decision to appoint this particular individual to the position of overseeing. This is a party donor and a lawyer by the name of Bob Aloensi. All right. So this is a guy who apparently has the important job of overseeing this. Actually, I don't think that is the right guy, is it? That's not the name of the person who got appointed to that. That's a different role altogether. But talk about the decision of the government to appoint a liberal connected person to this role of overseeing what the government has done vis-a-vis the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, this is a highly, highly sensitive topic, the imposition of martial law in Canada, because like, as you said, that's exactly what it was. It's the old War Measures Act with a new title on it. So you decide to, basically destroy people's civil rights. You decide to destroy people's lives. You just decide to actually create a run on the banks in Canada, which was a rather serious thing. And now you are required by law to have a commission of inquiry into this thing to see what actually led to it and what did the government do? How did they justify the decision to impose this most drastic of all parliamentary acts? And the problem here, I guess you can't say that just because somebody donates money to the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party or the NDP or the Greens or whatever, that you can never hold a public office of any sort. But in this case, the whole process is already heavily politicized. This individual is a repeated donor to the Liberal Party, and he used to work for the same law firm that Pierre Trudeau worked for in the past. So, there's nothing that says the guy is biased or crooked or wrong or anything like that. But perception is reality. People's perception of this process is already jaundiced. People's perception of the justice system has been badly beaten over the years. And now they've chosen a judge who has, sort of like multiple connections to the Liberal Party. And you just shake your head and say, come on, guys, try and get something right. So by comparison, I mean, I testified at the Royal Commission of Inquiry, which was the Air India inquiry. And the individual that ran that thing, the ramrod, was Mr. Justice Major, a former Supreme Court judge. And having looked at him in the past and having watched his operation, this was an incredibly skilled person. He did a good job ramrodding this thing, but he had no connections directly to the political parties that were carrying the weight on this thing. And in that case, it was the Conservative Party. And he had no connections to the actual case itself, the Khalistanis, the decision to blow up Air India, etc. So the Air India Commission of Inquiry went ahead. It occurred. A whole bunch of stuff came out. It accomplished its purpose, and it was run by somebody who appeared to be credible. And you got to think, in all of Canada right now, they couldn't find a retired Supreme Court judge, a retired federal court judge, or some person of standing and merit that could ramrod this thing. So unfortunately, I think to further compound the problem, at the same time this appointment nomination came out, Trudeau essentially let it be known that he would impose cabinet confidentiality on a whole bunch of the information. So in other words, the actual decision-making process inside cabinet as to why they chose to make the decision between imposing the Emergency Powers Act or not imposing the Emergency Powers Act will be exempt from examination. And even more interesting, and this is the part I'm interested in, is why did they suddenly yank the Emergency Powers Act 7 days later with no explanation? So unfortunately, before this thing even gets started, the critics of it are going to have a field day pointing out that it's, got so many inherent contradictions. Nonetheless, I think it's going to be an interesting exercise, Mark, because there were so many fake narratives generated by the government to justify their actions and to justify it, why they imposed this Emergency Measure Act, that have already been destroyed. So for instance, there was this report by the Toronto Star that loaded shotguns were found inside trucks in Ottawa. And of course, this has been completely debunked. The Ottawa police chief was forced to embarrassingly back down on this, no matter how hard he tried to get around it, and finally had to admit under questioning in Parliament that there were no guns found. The other thing is the arson at the building on Lisgar Street, was committed by convoy members. Well, turns out the Ottawa police, again, were forced to admit that the two fellows that set the building on fire, no connection whatsoever. The other thing of, there were terrorists in the convoy, completely debunked. The CBC's fake generated story about, the Russians are behind organizing this because Trudeau has been so hard on Putin, completely debunked, and even CBC has to back away on that one. The list goes on and on and on. The idea that the convoy advocated violence, that it didn't. The idea that they attacked a homeless shelter, which they didn't. The idea that crime went up because of the convoy. In fact, the opposite was true. Ottawa police came out and admitted crime dropped precipitously in the market area in the downtown core while the convoy was there, and then went back up after the convoy was there. And then there's all the other nonsense about American money was behind it. It was Americans doing it and all this foolishness. All these things are being debunked now. So I think the timing is going to be great for this. The government's going to have a hard time trying to advance its narrative on how horrible, evil, nasty, and bad the convoy were as they were eating dead, burnt babies and, promoting white supremacy. While at the same time, all this information is starting to come out that their entire narrative was willfully misleading and fake to start with. So
at one time, even rapists, they were even accused of being rapists at one time. So they threw everything they had at trying to denigrate who these convoy members were. Everything from, as you say, arsonists to Nazis to white supremacists to foreign agents to insurrectionists. I'm almost embarrassed for the media. They piled it on. But getting back to this appointee, the man's name is Paul Rouleau. He's a liberal appointed federal judge. This story in Blacklock's, named by cabinet to lead an inquiry into the use of emergency powers against the Freedom Convoy protesters. Rouleau was previously a partner in a Montreal firm whose associates included, what do you know, Pierre Trudeau. The quote in the story is, "We're looking forward to cooperating with Justice Rouleau to ensure that he has access to the information, including classified documents, so he could do his job." Well, what happened to the idea of cabinet confidentiality, Tom? I mean, either they're going to share these documents, internal documents, or they're not. Maybe they found somebody whom they can trust will be very discreet
Yeah.
in his managing and handling of these documents, you know. So I guess they don't have to play. Maybe they don't have to play the confidentiality card now that they have this liberal friendly judge overseeing the process. What do you think?
Yeah, the other thing that's unfortunate that follows from that is the direction, if you will, that the Commission of Inquiry is being given is very heavily leaning on to, what events did the convoy participate in that led up to the imposition of the Emergency Powers Act, as opposed to the flip side of that question is, what did the government do? What did they decide? How did they come to the decision to employ the Emergency Measures Act? So in other words, it almost sounds as though they're trying to shape the inquiry to just focus on the convoy itself, and sort of blame them for everything, and then go, well, the government was forced into it, and there we were. So yeah, it's unfortunate that the thing is off to a bit of a weak start. The good news is, I think, that it's going to come under a lot of public scrutiny now from probably not so much mainstream media, but a lot of other independent media. And perhaps more importantly, it's going to come under international attention. A lot of people in Ottawa, the sort of mindless drones, the bureaucrats, those kinds of people that are involved in these things, never really took on board the idea that this thing was not just Ottawa, it was right across Canada. And not only was it across Canada, it went across much of the rest of the world, New Zealand, Australia. It's popped up in China a few times. It popped up in Europe a lot. Trudeau got trashed at the European Union for his imposition of martial law while he was there. So this thing will come under scrutiny from civil rights organizations around the world. And I think the government sort of needs to appreciate the idea that there's going to be a magnifying glass put on a lot of actions here. And no matter how much they sort of try to hide it or misdirect it or create friendly witnesses only, the reality is it's going to get a lot of scrutiny, which I think is a good thing. I think there's a lot of things sort of piling up in civil society right now. One is, like, as you mentioned, the economy and inflation. People are starting to wonder, why is gasoline $1.90 a liter? Why is the price of eggs almost doubled? They're starting to wonder about the whole vaccine program. Is this thing really efficacious? Is it really safe? They're starting to wonder about their civil rights in Canada. I mean, can your bank account be frozen if you just say something bad about the government? So a whole bunch of issues are starting to pile up. And I think the whole idea of how badly can a government, which is to say, in this case, the government of Canada, how badly can they abuse the population? How many civil rights can they destroy before there's actual reaction? And I think the Ottawa set, which to them, I mean, Canada is whatever is 10 kilometers east or west of Ottawa. That's all they know. I think maybe a few of them are coming to the conclusion or starting to realize that Ottawa is fat, rich, dumb, and happy. Nobody lost very few people lost their jobs in Ottawa because of the pandemic. People got sent to work from home, or they just got sent home and got paid anyway. Whereas in the rest of the country, restaurants were closed, businesses were closed, mortgages were foreclosed. People suffered badly.
Take a breath while I introduce you. Tom Quiggin joining us on Saga 960. I know you've got a full head of steam there, but I got other questions to ask you, including this idea that somehow the RCMP had considered charging Justin Trudeau over the Aga Khan visit. You'll remember, of course, that Bahamian family vacation that Justin Trudeau took while the Aga Khan had business with the government. You recall this very well, Tom. I have to ask you because, of course, the RCMP now has come out that the reason they didn't charge Justin Trudeau, even though they had their suspicions that they could have charged him with fraud, that there was evidence piling up, they didn't in part because of the issue of public interest. And I really want to get your take on this. The idea that somehow it wasn't in the public's interest, according to the RCMP and Brenda Lucki, the commissioner, to go after this guy. Is it just a case that he's too far up, too high up the food chain, politically speaking, that somehow Canadians are okay if a trucker is charged? Hey, no problem with that. But somehow, if you're that high up, politically speaking, we can't touch it because it's in the political interest, to allow people to commit crimes if you're at the top? I mean, what's going on here?
Okay, so First off, a little disclosure here. I've been involved in a case where a very senior individual was under investigation. And the question had to be reached, does the investigation go ahead or does it get stopped? So what folks kind of have to get the idea is that when a prosecutor decides to file a criminal charge against somebody, there's essentially two standards that have to be met by the prosecutor. The first one is there reasonable likelihood of conviction? In other words, is there enough evidence piled up that if a reasonable group of people, i.e. a jury, or a reasonable individual, that is to say a judge, looked at it, the judge might go, yeah, this guy looks pretty guilty, let's nail him. So that's the first standard. So my impression of this case was there was information piling up that suggested, this may meet the standard, that there's sufficient information to ensure a likelihood of conviction. Now, the other standard that has to be met is it in the public interest? So to use a sort of extreme example, somebody gets caught jaywalking for the 10th time. Is it worth taking him to court, prosecuting him, spending all the money and using the court's time to prosecute somebody for, malicious jaywalking? And the answer is it's not worth the Crown's or the taxpayers' time, money, and effort to go after somebody on what is essentially a stupid charge. The flip side of that is, would the charge result in certain damages or upheavals or problems to the country or to certain organizations that outweigh the probative value of the evidence and everything else? And so what the head of the RCMP would tell you if she was forced to testify, she'd say, on the one hand, we had reasonable grounds for conviction. On the other hand, the damage this would do to the Canadian economy, the damage it would do to the political system, the upheaval, the costs of a new election outweighs the value of having somebody brought to justice. Now, I'm aware of that people lesser than the Prime Minister have been let off investigations or whatever because that standard wasn't met. So arguably, one could say that for the Prime Minister. Unfortunately, in this case, where we have a Prime Minister who has skated on so many different things throughout his life, sexual assault, the blackface thing, the SNC Lavalin thing, and of course the Aga Khan trip being the current one, the public, I think, is legitimate in their view that, there goes the Prime Minister skating away again with little or no punishment because of his incredibly high rank. So, I won't prejudge, what Brenda Lucki saw, what she heard, whatever. But as a citizen, I kind of look at it and say, yeah, this really needs to be addressed. That how many times can Trudeau skate before somebody finally says the value of going after a sitting prime minister is more important than whatever damage it might do to the government in the short term. In other words, we need to send a message to senior officials that are accountable at some point. And I think here in Canada, reasonable point to say we're there now.
Well, the implication here is that you can be above the law. And I'm sorry, but nobody is above the law unless you're living in a lawless country, which sadly, Canada appears to be drifting into that state where you've got a guy like Trudeau, who, as you said yourself, gets to skate. And then looming in the backdrop, of course, is what happened with SNC Lavalin, the obstruction of justice situation, the allegation, the proof that was tabled there by Jody Wilson-Raybould, former Attorney General, in the form of that phone call that was recorded and issued. And the RCMP, again, did nothing. So forget the Aga Khan for a minute. We have a repeated instance here where this guy gets off scot-free. Nobody in his office was charged. It just was made to go away. This sucks, Tom. This is not acceptable. This is not what countries that are not rife with corruption, get away with.
Yeah, there's always a case.
This is absolutely outrageous.
Yeah,
Brenda Lucki has to go.
Yeah, there's always a case to be made for executive privilege in every country, whether it's a democracy or whatever. Unfortunately, I think in Canada, what we've seen is it's not like Trudeau screwed up once and they kind of, is it worth all this in order to get rid of him and everything else. But unfortunately, I mean, what we see in the case of Trudeau is a repeated pattern of, the unknown events involving the underage girl at the school he got fired from, his sexual assault of the reporter, the SNC Lavalin thing, the We charity scandal, the convoy scandal, everything else. It's, as you say, it starts to pile up. And at a certain point, I think prosecutors in Canada have to say it does meet the standard of public interest that the Prime Minister and the Department of Justice wind up in a head-on collision between what is accountability on one hand and what is executive privilege on the other. And I think we're actually overdue. Like you said, too many people in the country now are, well, like your comment just popped up on your screen there, people are just sick and tired of this, that the Trudeau skates on the most egregious things on a repeated basis. And it's time to put some sort of accountability back into government, Mark.
But the idea, just think how outrageous it is that it's not in the public interest to go after a guy because he's at the top.
Well, where are the standards?
What am I missing here?
The standard there,
Tammy
Mark,
Douglas is right. I would assume
so
Tammy is right.
Yeah,
people are sick of it.
Yeah, to take an extreme.
You don't have law and order. You have a lawless situation when people at the top get to skate, and they are not held to the same level of scrutiny by the law enforcement agencies. That's why it's time maybe to defund the RCMP. They are too far gone. They are corrupt as an organization. The RCMP is corrupt, and they need to come under scrutiny now. They need to be examined for political corruption.
Yeah.
It's absolutely outrageous.
If you're trying to make the argument that the Canadian political system has been politicized from the Prime Minister's office right down to the desk level at the RCMP, probably correct. There is, however, like I said, there is a standard for is it in the public interest, which applies to common criminals as much as it applies to high-level criminals such as Trudeau. So to take an extreme example, if your country's in the middle of a war and your prime minister is about to make some key decisions and he's caught shoplifting, do you prosecute the guy for shoplifting at a time when everything is about to come apart? If a major economic crisis is just underway, is this the time to paralyze the executive branch of your government with a criminal prosecution while this is going on? And there's answers on both sides of that. But I think in this case, what you're probably trying to say, and most people agree with, it's not that Trudeau got away with it once. He got away with it 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Ergo, it's overdue for a change. And obviously,
we're not talking about we're talking about obstruction of justice here, not taking a candy bar, taking a Mars bar out of a convenience store. And fraud, right? So we're talking about fraud. We're talking about obstruction of justice, high crimes.
We're talking about $600 billion of pandemic spending, which we don't really know where it went.
The We scandal, the disappearance, the loss of billions of dollars. So clearly the pandemic was a license to steal for these people. So this guy, we have a criminal running this country, Tom, a criminal. And so the idea that somehow it's not in the public interest to go after people who are who are breaking the law brazenly because they think they can get away with it. Because if that's the attitude of our law enforcement agency, is that, well, if you're that high up, it's really not in the public interest to prosecute you. Well, in that case, you're giving this guy a blank check. You're saying you can do whatever the hell you want, Justin, because we're not going after you because it's just not in the public interest. You know what? It is in the public interest to go after criminals. And Justin Trudeau is in that category.
If you go back around, say, 2000, and I was working for the RCMP at the time, you could see and feel that there was some distance between the body of the RCMP itself, the commissioner, and the Prime Minister and the Attorney General or the Solicitor General at the time. However, now I think if you talk to people in the RCMP or you watch, the distance between those people, which should be substantial, is almost non-existent. So what has occurred is what I've mentioned before. It's the politicization of the system. And if people don't start speaking out and saying they want a Canadian general to run the military who is independent of the government, they want a commissioner of the RCMP who is independent of the government, they want somebody running CRA who
we don't even have a media that's independent of government. We don't have law enforcement that is independent of government. That's what they've done. That's what these
Yeah.
little commies have done. They've brought everybody in to their little group,
Yeah.
and they've made
The convoy-
everybody a stakeholder in the regime.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The convoy is a good example of that. The Ottawa police frontline officers were doing their absolute best to try and maintain the peace, which is their actual job, while their seniors were doing everything possible to create trouble. And you could see the stress within the police department between the sort of Diana Deans, the counselor, Chief Slowly himself, Mayor Watson, whatever. You could see the stress between the force itself and the politicians who were trying to force the police to do what the politicians wanted rather than what the law required. And I think that's one of the things that's going to come out of this inquiry is people were heavily critical of the Ottawa police. And it's a good question to raise because the frontline guys from sergeant down were trying to do a good job, whereas you could see a number of superintendents and the chief, whatever, were trying to do a political hatchet job. And that was, I think, one of the clearest examples. And I think the inquiry, hopefully, people will be able to bring that out during the inquiry, that the politicization of this continues. So just by example, one more quick example, interim Ottawa Police Chief Steve Bell, when he's testifying to Parliament about the weapons found in the convoy, he was asked, were there shotguns found? Were there loaded shotguns found in the convoy? And he goes, well, we're still investigating and charges haven't been laid. So the member of Parliament Dane Lloyd comes back and he says, yeah, okay, but were weapons found? And he goes, well, it's an ongoing investigation. You have to understand, complex problem, blah, blah, blah. And he comes back the third time and he says, great, fine. But tell me, were there loaded shotguns found in the convoy as had been reported by the Toronto Star, quoting a police source? And he goes on again. And only in the fourth time does he finally go, well, yeah, there weren't any found. So it's fascinating. There is a political figure who he was the third police chief, by the way, during the convoy situation. He is willfully attempting to misdirect, or as my mother would have called it, lied to a member of Parliament by trying to infer that, well, the investigation into the weapons goes on, when in fact they found none. So that's, the kind of thing right there in Parliament with the cameras running and with this being recorded. We see a political figure, i.e. the Ottawa police chief, trying to misdirect and push the member of Parliament away from the actual truth that no guns were found. And member of Parliament Dane Lloyd, credit to him, he kept going after the guy 3-4 times in order to finally get him to answer the question. And this, of course, was after the convoy was over. It's gone. It's not the heat of the battle anymore. But yet here we see political figures trying to misdirect politicians again. And, it's the politicization. There's the problem again.
And it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. My issue is that, how bad does it have to get before something is done about it? And sadly, what kind of a cleanup will have to take place? It's going to be mammoth, but I got to wrap things up. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show. Always a pleasure. Really appreciate this as always.
Cheers, Mark. Tom
Quiggin joining us on Saga 960. And that's it for this edition of the show, of this segment, rather. And we got to take a quick commercial break. Back with more on Newstalk Saga 960 and the Mark Petroni Show after this.